We were part of a homeschool network, and there happened to be an offering of a taekwondo class. And my son came to me and said, I want to do this. And my first reaction was, oh, we're Mennonites. We don't do that.
Okay. 1, 2, ready, go.
Welcome to the Called to Be Bad podcast. My name is Mariah Martin, and I feel called to be bad. It turns out I'm not the only one. Join us as we dig into all things bad, scandalous, deviant, you know, the stuff that makes good church folks squirm in the sanctuary. Why? Well, because sometimes the scandalous is spiritual, deviant is divine, and bad is beautiful. Say yes to the call, and let's see what holy trouble we get into today. Hello, Tim.
Hello.
Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So this is Tim Peebles. By vocation, he is a theological educator, a Mennonite pastor, martial arts instructor, and most recently, a podcaster. Woohoo!
Yes.
With a focus on Anabaptist theology, missional church, and embodied peacemaking. He and his wife lived in Chicago for 25 years, most of that in Rogers Park neighborhood, for those of you who know Chicago. And he has recently moved to Bradford, England to work for Anvil Trust. In addition to reading and talking theology, church, and martial arts, his hobbies include movies, heavy metal music, whiskey, and tap dancing, which is a delightful assortment of hobbies. I love that. I love people with varied interests. So I'd like to start off by introducing our drinks.
Okay.
I have regular black coffee, my usual, in a green mug with yellow stars on it. And I'm very interested in hearing what you have today.
So I brought the bottle with me. I thought since whiskey is in my introduction, I should show the bottle. I can't tell if that's backward or not, but this is Auchentoshan. This is a single malt Scotch from south of Glasgow, and it's aged. All Scotch is aged in burnt oak casks, but this one is aged in a couple other kind of casks as well. So it's called 3 Wood. It's my favorite single malt Scotch. And since we've moved here with sparse possessions, I'm not using a proper Glencairn glass. I'm drinking it out of something between a wine glass and a whiskey glass, I suppose. So this is what I'm drinking as we talk.
Okay, wonderful. So before we get started and into a lot of our conversation, I do want to give a content warning because we filmed this afterwards, but we did end up talking about the ways martial arts can be used in situations of assault, particularly sexual assault. Tim, do you want to add anything?
We don't get into specifics of that.
Right.
But if it is something that's difficult to hear mentioned, then take care of yourself. Maybe come back to it later.
Right. Well, today for Tim's topic, we're not talking about whiskey, although we probably could. We are going to talk about his martial arts practice and how that relates to peace theology. And so to start off, I'm curious, what kind of martial arts do you practice?
Usually I start by saying I practice Korean martial arts. Martial arts typically come from other places, other parts of the world, and it's a part of honoring those cultures to identify where the art comes from. So I practice Korean martial arts. Karate comes from Japan. Kung Fu comes from China. From Korea, we have Hapkido and Taekwondo. I have a black belt in Hapkido, and I have a 4th degree black belt in Taekwondo. Within martial arts, then, once you've identified where they come from, you can identify styles. And so one way to identify style is it a soft art or a hard art, or a grappling art and a striking art? Soft arts are more grappling. Hard arts are striking. So Taekwondo is a striking art. Hapkido is a mix of striking and grappling. And then finally, both are upright arts. They're done mostly on their feet. They're not ground martial arts like wrestling or Brazilian jiu-jitsu or things like that, which are more ground grappling arts. So Korean, upright, hard striking arts.
Okay. Yeah.
Which makes it, I mean, to be a Mennonite pacifist and any martial arts is already a little bit iffy, but then to do a hard striking art pushes that even further out. Something like Aikido, which is often presents as a sort of soft grappling art where you're using someone's power against them and so forth. That has a little bit more intuitive connection with proactive peacemaking, I suppose, but hard striking art's a little harder sell.
Right. Yeah. And I think, I don't know if we made this connection before, but I think that we met one time when you came to my peace theology class and you taught a bit about Aikido for Joe Lichty's class. Do you remember coming to that class at all?
So I've been to Joe's classes on 3 or 4 occasions.
Okay.
But there's also been a couple times that a friend of mine who also does similar things, Steve Thomas.
Okay, it wasn't Steve, because I know Steve led a different session that I was in, and I remember it because they, at the end, like the finale was that someone would break a board with their elbow, and Steve's the other instructor that was there, I don't remember her name, she pointed at me, probably because I was the smallest one in the room, and she said, "You are going to break the board," and I was like, "I'm gonna break the board." Like, are you sure? And she like lined me up and she told me, she's like, your power comes from your core, not your arm. Yeah. And like had me practice a couple times. And then I did it first try. And nice. I was so proud of myself. I actually kept the boards. They're around here somewhere. Oh, that's embarrassing.
No, does it say break the cycle of violence? Does it say break the cycle of violence on it? Sometimes we used to write that on there.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, but you can see how they lined up for.
And that's a good real board too. That's not one of those sort of easy break boards. So
I was pretty proud of myself. But anyway, so I remember that was Steve Thomas, but I'm pretty sure it was you that came and you led an exercise where you were facing each other across a line.
Yes.
And you needed to get the other person on your side. And people.
By any means necessary.
By any means necessary, yes. And people started like wrestling each other, trying to force each other across the line. And then at the end, you revealed, you'll say it better than me, but say what you're.
Well, so you line people up you put a rope on the floor first. So that automatically makes people sort of frame the encounter as some kind of competition, maybe.
Right.
And then you stand across from one another. I'm very clear to say your partner. And then I separate the groups away from the rope and I talk to each group individually saying, your job is to get your partner on your side of the line any way possible other than hurting them.
Right.
And then I go and tell the other group the same thing. And I bring you to the line and I say, go. And inevitably, people try talking first, especially among Mennonite circles. But then quickly it turns into kind of tug of war and in some cases, outright wrestling matches. Then we stop and break and ask how many people are successful in this. Never had anybody do it on the first try.
Right.
But then I say, okay, now I want you to, let's redo the exercise. And this time you can't place your hands on someone. But I want you to think about whether there's a way you can do this so that both of you win. And then it takes, you can see a trickle effect usually. At some point, you can see the light bulb go on and they switch places with their partner.
Right. All you have to do is walk it, switch places, and you both win. There doesn't need to be any force. And that has stuck with me. I mean, that was probably like 2014 or 2015.
Okay.
And that I've remembered that ever since. I think I also maybe remember you and Joe like wrestling on the ground or something, or just Joe wrestling with someone.
Yes. Yes, that might have been the first time we did it.
Okay.
Because we often use the example of a peace theology educator falling to the same trap. I mean, the whole point of it is to say that our behaviors are triggered by how we perceive our environments and by how we frame things. And if we see this as competition rather than a collaborative sort of thing, then we automatically launch a certain sequence of engagements. But if we see it as a collaborative thing, then we go about it differently. And so that's just one of our number of teaching tools to help people realize that violence doesn't just happen. It happens in a context where there are cues, where there are presumptions built in, where there are stories that we tell leading up to that point. And it's fun to do too.
Yeah, it was really fun. Yeah, it's amazing how quickly you can create an atmosphere of competition and us versus them. And how much animosity you can generate for like the other team or against the other team. I mean, And yeah, I kind of have this theory. This is maybe a little off topic, but I have this theory that football or other like contact sports that are particularly aggressive are military training. That we push our kids into these sports because we want them to have this ethic of obedience and competition and desire to win and oppress the other side. And that almost grooms them into military type thinking. Mm-hmm. And so then they're ready to go to war. And I say this as someone who played soccer in high school and college, and I loved it. And so I'm not anti-sports. I just see this, animosity generated.
Yeah, I share some of that ambivalence about sports. On the flip side of it, I've learned from some folks that sports as a form of aggressive play can be a way of surfacing and sublimating, surfacing and attending to our aggressive tendencies. That these, especially for young boys who are enculturated into aggressiveness by our wider culture, that having a pretend environment where that aggression can be channeled in certain ways, as long as there's with it sportsmanship and appreciation for beautiful play on both sides, there are other things. I do think perhaps sports has become more ruthless and warlike, perhaps as more money is attached to it, but at its best, it can be not unlike martial arts. It can be a way of surfacing emotions, feelings, thoughts, energies that go into creating violence and then can do something transformative with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my dad says that one of his regrets in raising me and my sister is that he didn't get us early on into some sort of martial arts. Hello, beloved baddies. A quick break to tell you that this episode is sponsored by the Center for Art, Humor, and Soul, a nonprofit that supports and amplifies the voices of edgewalkers through art that catalyzes change, laughter that brings us together, and soul awakening to the creative spark within us. The support from the Center for Art, Humor, and Soul has meant the world to this podcast. So I highly encourage you to check out their website, arthumorandsoul.com, to see their other featured artists and projects. If you want to support the podcast, you can check out our Patreon or get in touch. Now I'll let you get back to this episode of Called to Be Bad. But I'm curious how you got into martial arts. How were you attracted to it? How did you start?
I didn't grow up Mennonite. I grew up in conservative, fundamentalist, red state America. And so dreamed of being a soldier in some ways, was drawn to warlike approaches to life and so forth. And martial arts, there were martial arts movies and all of that were part of my childhood. And so always was kind of interested in doing martial arts. Years later, by this point, I'd had my Anabaptist conversion. I had become a good Mennonite pacifist, was committed to nonviolence, not just as a prohibition against being a soldier, being a police officer, killing, but kind of as a pervasive way of life. It factored into being a vegetarian. It factored into how we parented. We were in a Mennonite church. My son, who was maybe 10 at the time, had experienced some bullying, sadly enough, at church. In the church youth group. And my perception of him in these encounters and as he recounted them was that there was a degree of helplessness involved. And so he would go from kind of a cowering submission to an all-out rage. And there was nothing in between. And neither of these looked good for him. And they certainly weren't good for the overall environment either. And we just struggled with that for a number of years. What do we do with that? How do we empower him to be present in that moment in a proactive way that honors his own well-being and integrity, but not at the expense of someone else when he's overpowered by others. We were part of a homeschool network, and there happened to be an offering of a taekwondo class, and my son came to me and said, I want to do this. And my first reaction was, oh, we're Mennonites, we don't do that.
Right.
But then I thought back to these kind of bullying situations, and I thought, maybe this is an experiment worth trying. It's just a class. He's there with his peers and his friends. I'll go and be there for every class and watch and observe, and we can kind of discern together. The first class, the instructor introduced himself to me and talked with me a bit while the kids were out on the floor doing exercises. And I said, I always wanted to do this. And just mentioned it in passing. And he said, well, what's keeping you? He said, this is an open class. There's no reason you can't do this. And I thought, oh, okay. So I could actually do this with my son. And we can kind of discern together whether this is a good thing. And so we entered into this in a kind of experimental fashion, him as a form of connecting with his peers, developing some physical competence and emotional confidence, two things that I came to repeat in my use of martial arts for peace education, that we're more inclined to be peaceful if we have both of those things, physical competence and emotional confidence.
Physical competence, emotional confidence. I like that.
I would add a relational connection as well, that when you, and what you get in a martial arts class is education in those three things. You're developing your physical competence. And that's not just towards aggression. In some cases, that is towards moderating your aggression, towards containment, and towards channeling. For others, it's an empowerment to be strong physically and to be present physically in a way that they might not be used to. This roughly falls along gender lines, but not always. And so in martial arts, a traditional martial arts, not a competitive martial arts environment, but a traditional one, you're there to develop yourself in a community with others. And you develop on these things. You're always working with a partner. You have obligations to the partner you're working with. If it's your junior, you have obligations to be sort of teaching them or passing on whatever wisdom you have. If it's your senior, your posture is one of learning and respectful attention to what they're passing on to you. So there's relational connection that builds. The emotional confidence. Most people, there's nobody born a martial artist. And to do it, you have to go through training that usually takes people through stages of discomfort, significant discomfort. And that surfaces a range of emotions, the same kinds of emotions that are often triggered in violent encounters. And so in martial arts training, your emotions are being transformed in the direction of having a confident presence that both I deserve to be in this space and I have resources to sort of honor and protect my space.
Right.
That's why I got into it. And I think you can probably see the seeds of how that sort of fed into a kind of missional sensibility for me as a Mennonite living in an urban context with significant youth violence around me. Most of that from young people who were different from me and race and class and education. And so I started thinking maybe this could be a tool. Maybe this could be a bridge across differences between me and my neighbors. And maybe when we cross that bridge, it can be a backbone for a kind of community building, personal development that can work towards violence reduction in the lives of young people where violence was already a pervasive part. We weren't starting from scratch. They already had violence in their neighborhood, in their schools, in their personal lives in many cases. And so this became a tool for character formation and community connection that could reduce some of the triggers and pathways into overt violence.
Right. Yeah, let's go into that more.
Okay.
How do you reconcile your martial arts practice with peace theology? How do they relate? How do they conflict if they might.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I suppose peace theology comes in lots of different forms, doesn't it?
Yes, true.
And if it's religiously oriented peace theology, that also comes in lots of different forms.
Right.
I'm a Christian. I'm a Christian pastor in a Mennonite form, and so my nonviolence is rooted in the life and work of Jesus. I look to Jesus and how he lived his life. And what he taught. So we have his teachings, we have his stories, we have his examples of what he did. And I'm part of a Anabaptist tradition that looks back to those and says there's something about that that is properly called pacifist, not passive,
right,
but pacifist in the literal sense, the Latin word meaning peacemaking, of working towards peace. And that's the way we talk and interact and respond to conflict is part of contributing to a pattern of life that is also a peaceful pattern of life, which I think Jesus was oriented to. So my nonviolence is very much rooted in the teachings and the work of Jesus. But, that was 2,000 years ago. And the context for that was very different than our context. It was in some ways a very patriarchal context. It was a very ethnically specific context. And so there were a number of things that are typical of violence in our context and our time and place that just are never in discussion, really, in the teachings of Jesus. To take two that have been central to my work that were kind of what pushed me towards considering this. One is bullying. And the other is sexual assault.
Right.
Both of these are situations where someone with more power is taking advantage of someone with less power. They're not doing so for political reasons. They're doing so for interpersonal reasons of a variety of sorts. When I take those situations and the stories I've heard from people, and I go to Jesus and I say, what does Jesus have to say about that? There's just not much there. So far as I can tell, there's no teaching in the New Testament anywhere about how to respond to sexual threat or a sexual assault, or how to respond to possible or actual bullying. And so that meant there was a gap between how I understood the teachings and work of Jesus and my own context. And that required coloring outside the lines a little bit. And my intuition is that Jesus's advocacy of nonviolence is almost always in a political context. It's towards a particular understanding of how to be God's people in the world. So it's about how God provides and protects God's people as a whole. It's not about interpersonal interactions. And I just couldn't imagine the Jesus who was so much about empowering the vulnerable and freeing the vulnerable from their sort of traps in the wider culture that they were part of. I couldn't imagine Jesus saying to the victims of bullying or sexual assault that thing I said over there about turn the other cheek, well, that's true here too. It grated. There was just dissonance in that. And so I started exploring alternatives. Walter Wink has an interpretation of Jesus's turn the other cheek, that it's actually a kind of provocation. It's a kind of nonviolent defiance.
Right.
And so there's a number of ways of engaging biblical texts and the teachings of Jesus that I think create a little more space for this third way that combines traditional martial arts, which has a code that says we avoid rather than confront. If confrontation happens, we stun rather than hurt. We hurt rather than seriously injure. We injure rather than seriously maim. We maim rather than kill. I mean, there's a scale and there's a code for abiding by that. And so I found a kind of mix between those two. And in my own conscience, I said, I won't kill. And I won't, I mean, to the best of my ability, I won't kill or seriously impair, maim, permanently impair someone. But inflicting pain and injury and harm that can be healed, and is in service of preventing greater harm, especially for the more vulnerable.
Right.
I came to a place in my conscience that I was okay with that.
Right. So it's like an ethic of reducing harm reduction,
yes,
and de-escalation.
yes,
yeah, that makes sense.
And you know, the truth of the matter is that a lot of historic Anabaptism, of course, emerged in a context of intense persecution. But the nonviolence and pacifism of the Mennonite community that emerged over the centuries since then has largely been advocated by folks who were living in fairly rural contexts. Often were not wrestling with the kinds of encounters that I was talking about, that were just daily, regular encounters in the context I was living in. And so in that sense, at worst, they were advocating nonviolence from a position of safety.
Right.
At best, they were just in a different place. I mean, they weren't in a place where violence is already present, and the issue is how do we reduce it, rather than there's no violence, and then all of a sudden violence shows up. How do I respond to it? Those are very different kinds of scenarios, and you know, depending on where you are, I suppose, you're more likely to be in one of those than the other. So I'm more drawn to harm reduction. And not just for myself, but for the overall environment. That means the other person who's involved, the community that's involved. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Several thoughts going on in my head.
Yeah.
One of them is, yeah, I've it's natural to go through these like what if scenarios, especially like as far as self-defense. And I will often be walking down the road and my brain will be like, well, what if someone jumps out and attacks you? You know, what are you going to do? And growing up in this like Mennonite Anabaptist, you know, peace building, it's kind of, what's the word? Nurtured in you, I guess, to like come up with these creative third way responses rather than reacting violently, which, like you said, can be problematic if it's coming from a place of safety. But I often will, and I've read books where it's like, what's the book? What would happen?
You do?
Yeah, what would you do? And so like I'll be walking along and I'll be carrying like a bunch of tamales. Like I'll have just gone to our local Universal Tamale and I'll think, okay, if someone attacks me, I'm just gonna say, hey, do you want some tamales? Here, take my tamales, and then like run away. You know, just do something like odd that will catch them off guard. I remember also in my high school, which was a public high school, not private, not Mennonite affiliated, there was an officer that came and talked to us in one of our health classes. And I don't know how it related to health, but she was talking about if she was ever attacked, she would do anything she could to get out of this situation. That's graphic, but she said, I will pee, I will poop, I will throw up, I will act like I'm a monkey, I will become a gremlin. Like she was just going on about how like she would be as weird as possible to creep out the other person to get out of the situation. And I was like, wow, that's so interesting. I never thought about that. So I've always been kind of, and of course that wouldn't work in necessarily every situation, but I like this kind of creative out of the box thinking. Where was I going with that? Yeah, just that's something that I think about a lot. But it would also be nice to have the physical skills that if I can't talk my way out of a situation, that I could feel empowered to get out, to get away, and to get away in a way that respects the other person. And I know not many people would understand that because they're like, well, they're attacking you. Why would you give them any modicum of respect? And maybe this is out of my own, I don't know, naivete, but I do still want to think of people as children of God, and that everyone
Mm-hmm.
deserves respect, whether or not they are respecting me. And, if I can reduce the harm in that, like I can keep them from doing harm, I want to.
Yes.
I'm not saying that that's how I'll respond in every situation. And again, this is very hypothetical. I've never been put in this situation, and I would never judge anyone that reacted violently or didn't react, or whatever you need to do to get out of the situation. But yeah, these are just thoughts that are
yeah. I've read those same books, and to me, they're useful in reminding us that we have more resources available to us than we typically think. I mean, it's again going back to that story of framing. It introduces variables into the mix. I think they would be a little more useful if they also recounted stories where people did all those things and it didn't work.
Right.
And they would also be useful if they were to be brought into conversation with folks who study dedicated predatory violence. Predatory violence meaning violence done to other people, treating them as prey for property or for some other value. So sexual assault being a sort of key example of that. Sociologists and psychologists who study this will, I think, tell you that folks can be very dedicated in what they're trying to do and what they want to do. And I think most of us are not going to encounter that. And so we don't need to spend all of our lives preparing for the worst case scenarios. That's true. And that's a reminder Mennonites often make. And I hear that. But it is common enough.
Right.
The numbers are sometimes 1 in 4 women report some sort of sexual assault or sexual aggression towards them. Bullying is a leading cause of depression and suicide for young people. And so given the pervasiveness of that, I think it's incumbent upon us, if we're advocating peace, to be truthful about the realities we're being peaceful in. And if it's the case that there are dedicated, there are folks committed to a kind of predatory violence, then we need a range of an inventory of responses, as you've just said. And so, yes, sometimes there will be, well, one other thing to throw in here, I forgot this part, is that FBI folks who study assaults and things like that will say there's a pattern to this, that the pattern is trying to overwhelm and surprise. And psychologically, our brains need time to process. And all of those storytelling, all of that acting weird, all of those sorts of things require a little bit of space to access those parts of our brain that can do that.
Right.
And sometimes predatory violence happens so quickly by intent to overwhelm and to suppress that we go immediately into a kind of fight or flight or freeze state of mind. We can't help it.
Right.
It's the way our brain works. And so part of self-defense training, martial arts training is learning how to engage that part of our instinct, our fight or flight instinct, to be present in it. When I do self-defense work, I teach very rudimentary body movements, not high precision things, but rudimentary things that even when your brain is largely shut down, you can do these things, all with the intent of creating enough space to get away. Now, these things might do harm to another person, not typically things that would be permanently harmful. A bruised testicle, a broken nose, a pinch on the underarm. I mean, all of these things hurt, but they aren't permanently impairing, and they're not worse than the outcome of the alternative. So to me, I respect folks who consider all of that and say, I'm still committed to nonviolence. I won't do any of that. Right. What I do in my training, and you were part of one of these, is to say there's a continuum of bodily responses, including eye contact, voice, posture, stunning, redirecting, restraining, striking, assaulting. That continuum gives people the option to say, okay, in my conscience, here's where I might draw the line. And everything beneath that line, I'm going to practice. I'm going to do a little bit of training, not just devote my life to it, but to do a little bit of training. I want to rehearse as you do when you're walking home. What am I going to do? What am I going to say? I do self-defense training, and an hour and a half can teach people some basic physical skills for emergency when nothing else works.
Right. Kind of along those lines, what do you think our peace theology could learn from or benefit from the martial arts?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think I've sort of hinted at some of that already. But one thing I haven't said is that I find that Western Christianity, I grew up in fundamentalist and evangelical backgrounds, which are more prone in this direction, I suppose. But I think it's true even in the Mennonite circles that I've been a part of, that there's a kind of intellectualizing of faith or spiritualizing of faith. That there's a way to be faithful that doesn't require routine, ritual, practice, ongoing work. And the pandemic has taught me that a couple months out of a martial arts class and skills start eroding.
Right.
You can't be a martial arts unless you practice. You can't be a martial artist unless you practice martial arts. It has to be routinely practiced and internalized by that. And I've wondered what Christian faith would look like if it were primarily understood in terms of how does this shape us to be embodied in relation to other people, and what are the rituals, the practices, the routines that we as a community advocate for our members, so that when we enter into those rituals and routines, we are transformed into people who behave in certain ways and carry ourselves in certain ways in the world. I think some of this happens often by accident. I just think that martial arts, it puts it front and center. You can't think yourself into being a martial artist. You have to do it.
Yeah.
And thinking of Christian faith along these lines, I think would be quite useful. It would be a nice contrast to the usual way we think about faith in Western context, which is, well, I believe these right things. I feel these right feelings. I have these kind of spiritual senses. But then how do I put those into practice? At best, there's actual routines and rituals that we don't know about, or we don't reflect on, that are shaping us. At worst, they're not there at all, and we just fumble about, and faith doesn't become who we are, how we carry ourselves, how we interact with others.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I love moving us from our mind to our body, even though our mind is part of our body, but we kind of think of our mind, of our thoughts, as this like abstract floaty thing. But I love that idea of moving our faith, moving our peace theology, our theology in general, into our bodies.
Yes.
Into our practices. And just like any art, that practice, that it takes practice. So yes. Again, as someone who played soccer for a long time, that hits me, I'm like, yes, I need to go practice my faith in an embodied way. I love that.
And the thing is that I think this is just intrinsic to being human. We learn by imitating. Those imitations are patterned, and those patterns are sometimes reflected on and given names. And so right there you have human life being shaped by habits and liturgies. Our Mennonite heritage is very low church, anti-liturgy, anti-ritual. But I think we need to learn something different about that it's deeply ingrained in us that we're going to be shaped by some ritual and some liturgy or other. And if we can't name the ones that we're going to be shaped by, we're going to be shaped by some other ones, which are usually going to be American, capitalist, consumerist.
Yeah.
So this is something I learned from martial arts. I'm a Korean. I'm a taekwondo black belt. I'm not a black belt in karate or kung fu. I'm a black belt in taekwondo. That's who I am.
Right.
It's what I carry in my body, in my posture, in my instincts, in my emotions, in my thoughts. And that only emerged through entering into a community with its ethos and its rituals and rhythms, and how those then are internalized in me over 15 years of doing that.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you were talking, it reminded me of this book that I read in seminary that I love and stuck with me. And it's called You Are What You Love, The Spiritual Power of Habit. Have you read that book?
Is that James K.A. Smith?
Yes. What you were saying, it sounded like verbatim, like lines from his book.
Yes.
Especially that like we are formed by rituals, and we need to be aware of what rituals are forming us, and be intentional about that. Because if we aren't, then it'll be the kind of script that society gives us, like you said, like capitalism. And yeah, that's a good book. I highly recommend You Are What You Love by James K.A. Smith.
I like his 2 books on cultural liturgies as well.
Oh, okay.
Desiring the Kingdom and Imagining the Kingdom, I think, are the 2. I can't remember which order they're in, but
yeah,
basically a way of saying we're intrinsically liturgical creatures, and we're either conformed to the liturgies of the empire and the American way of life, or something else, and that something else requires alternative liturgies.
And embodied practices.
And that's right. Liturgies always have to be said. We have to place ourselves in them and submit to them in certain ways. The other interesting thing is that when you train in anything, this probably from soccer as well, there will be times you're in a soccer practice where you're just really engaged, your mind's focused, and you're intensely involved. And then there'll be times where you're just not fully present. You just showed up, you dragged your body, and you're just doing what you have to. But nonetheless, something still happens.
Right. You
from
still
being there.
Showed up.
Yeah. And liturgy is like that. At its best, when we bring our full selves to it, it does more to us. But liturgy has power over us, even when we're not paying attention, even when we're not at our best. I didn't choose to be a capitalist. I didn't choose to be a consumer. I haven't focused my attention on being a good consumer. I just am one because it happened to me by being born in this context. And so, again, this is more for a church level. If churches think of what kind of culture do we have and what kind of liturgy do we use to describe that, and what are the rituals and rhythms within that, we're always prepared to say why we do it and what this is oriented to, but it's going to do its work with people just showing up. When they show up with full commitment and engagement, that's going to be better, but it still has effect even if they don't.
All right. That reminds me of like the distinction between like orthodoxy, right thinking, and orthopraxy, right practice. Yeah. Okay. And how would you respond if someone told you that you were a bad, particularly Mennonite in this case because of its connection to peace theology? If you were a bad Mennonite for practicing martial arts.
Well, I suppose if I were
like a jab to the throat and walk away.
Yeah, I was going to say I would, strike them and humble them in some way, or strike out verbally in some ways. But no, it was a learning journey for me. And I didn't get to where I am by just flipping a switch. It was a process, and I had to try out some things. I had to think through some things. I had to read. I found Steve Thomas, who was doing the same kind of thing a few years ahead of me. And so that gave me a model to kind of look at. And so anybody that would say I was a bad pastor, I would probably grant the legitimacy of that and say, I mean, given certain understandings of pastor, I don't fit. I accept that, but let me tell you my story of how I got to where I am.
I love it. Well, it's a tradition to end with a blessing.
Okay.
To you and all the viewers and listeners. Would it be okay if I bless you?
It will. Should we have a drink first before we do
that?
that?
Sure. Cheers. Yeah,
Cheers.
You haven't touched your whiskey.
I have a couple times.
Okay, I must have missed it.
I'm down to the last sip, so yeah.
That's great. So Tim and all you viewers and listeners, may you go from this podcast feeling empowered to show up, to be embodied, and to live out your peace theology in your everyday life. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you so much for being on. This was a delightful conversation.
Well, thanks for having me.
I can't wait
wonderful.
to pursue martial arts, to break some more boards. I'm excited. That's all for this episode of Called to Be Bad. Keep being your bad, beautiful selves, and I will see you next time.